Hi. So I recently just finished playing Octopath Traveler 2, and I kind of just wanted to give my thoughts on it. As like for me, especially, it's my first like JRPG that I've really kind of delved into. If like you don't really count Pokemon as like a JRPG, and you hear about all these great JRPGs, like you have your Final Fantasy and you have your Persona 5 and all of that. But for me, I don't know, especially as a Switch player, that idea of the Octopath Traveler and the way that it was made specifically for the Switch when it launched just became appealing to me. And then when I saw the reviews for Octopath Traveler 2 and it went on sale, I was like, aye, well then I gotta cop it. So I kind of just wanted to give my thoughts about it, thoughts about the game, because I have a lot of thoughts about the game. I have lots of things I like and lots of things I kind of despise. But first, there were a couple things to me first that I wanted to get into that were weird to me as someone who's never played a JRPG before. Like one thing that was very made like in my face was this idea of the path actions in front of me, where it was very bizarre for me to have a scenario where the character has to directly interact with the environment, and there's like choreographed ways to direct with the environment. Well, like when I play a lot of action games, like for example, I played like Spider-Man or Horizon Zero Dawn on my PlayStation, going from the idea that you can just go however you want and just the main focus is the combat and the gameplay to to a scenario where you're very much forced to interact with the people and the NPCs around you was very jarring to me at the beginning, but also it kind of gave me a very much a greater appreciation for the characters and the world building around me as I was playing the game. Like it was something I'd never experienced before, and it really gave me a deeper appreciation for the amount of time and effort that developers put into this kind of thing of making the world seem livable. Even on what a smaller scale of Octopath Traveler 2, where there's like maybe 10, 12 NPCs per city, and you just have one specific dialogue interaction, but you have all the path actions where you can use like Cassie's Inquire to kind of find out more about them and get a nice backstory, which I found myself doing a lot more than I thought I would, which is really bizarre because I initially when I thought I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna read all this, which is another thing for me. It's like all this the big main thing for me in the JRPGs that I didn't like, especially with Octopath, and that was very jarring to me was that it was all the dialogue I got. Because the thing about Octopath is that the art style is gorgeous, but because of the pixel art, it makes the facial expressions very limited. And when you have characters just standing around in a cutscene, just talking to each other for like hours and hours of the game, and they don't move because they're talking, right? But then you don't see any facial expressions or any, and the tone of voice sometimes in the voice acting is delivered well, but other times, especially with the like Agnia, for example, I really didn't like her voice actor. It really felt like her voice actor was in my face a lot of the time. No offense, Agnia, but then I had some other great ones. Like I loved Partitio's Western accent. I thought that was great, and I thought that was something I wouldn't have seen in a JRPG. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, I just wanted to comment on the fact that those path actions were so bizarre to me, but yet they made me kind of appreciate the game as I go on, especially in those early hours. I think that's what really pushed me because I do have a problem with the early hours, and I kind of just want to go like step by step. I kind of have notes here of just like the gameplay, the story, and the art direction and visual style, and then I'll just give my final thoughts at the end as a nice like retrospective on Octopath Traveler 2. I just want to note real quick, I did drop the game basically. Like I played like 60 hours in the game and I've beaten all the characters' chapters, but I didn't finish all the double chapters, the dual chapters. I forget what they're called with the cross paths, and I didn't get to the final chapter unfortunately because I just could not drag myself to do. Once I finished that final chapter for my final character, I was just like I could not do this anymore, and I just put the game down because my motivation at that point was so low, and it had me thinking like, why do I even need to finish this? Like I've already put so much time, and I have a really good understanding of the game at this point. Like for me, that I'm not benefiting, you know. Even if I want to see the big payout and how all the characters merge together, which people say is the best, I just couldn't get through those cross paths. I can't lie; those were boring. But anyway, I just wanted to just kind of dive into it, and I kind of want to start with the gameplay, some pros and cons. So I think honestly the gameplay, especially as someone who played like a lot of Pokemon, so I really like that turn-based stuff, and I've played a lot of Pokemon ROM hacks like Unbound, Insurgents, and also played a little bit of Showdown time to time. So for me, I'm quite well versed. Like I'm not well versed, but you know, like I play turn-based stuff, and for me, this breaking and boosting system and makes every single fight unique, and I love it so much because it's no longer just about like finding the elemental weaknesses. Like for example, when I was playing Dragon Quest 11, I did try out Dragon Quest 11. I had the demo. The demo was like 10 hours long, so I got like pretty deep into it. I was really forcing myself to. But one thing is that the fights felt very samey. Like I was just picking the strongest attack or like that's kind of concept. Whereas in Octopath, it's really a matter of like each specific enemy has a specific thing that can be broken, And also, you could choose how to want to make your boosts every single time, which I think is great because you could do like a more like support style, you could do a more offensive style, you could do some healing, you could just start stacking up buffs with boosts. There's so many different options you can do for every single part, every single fight, and I just think that made the game so much more replayable. I will say though that the random encounters, especially towards the later half of the game, just got really, really irritating for me. Especially because at some points I was just kind of trying to explore and backtrack through some areas. Like a lot of areas in Octopath, like between the cities, you have like these explorable, like basically they're just straight lines, right? They're glorified straight lines, but there are little nooks and crannies where you have chests and other hidden things. And just for me to go get those chests felt like such a hassle just because I have all these random encounters. And I got to a point where my characters were like level 50 and I was just going through like a level 20 area because there was a dungeon there I wanted to go to. But because of all the encounters, I just got annoyed. Like I couldn't even reach the dungeon. I just got so annoyed. It got to a point actually where I just literally like got Hikari. I gave him latent power, the latent power passive ability from Merchant, where it just respawns like every time you enter a fight. And then I just gave him. I literally just put Hikari at the front with a step ahead, and just made him do so good to send every single fucking random encounter because I just could not take it anymore. Like it really got to the point where I just could not handle the amount of random encounters, and it really took away from the main gameplay loop. That being said, the boss fights themselves are great. I love the scale. I love the fact that when you enter the boss fight, the mobs are it's just gigantic. It's looming over you, and each boss fight has a lot of specific gimmicks, which I kind of like. I don't really want to get into spoiler territory, but like there are a couple boss fights like they could close off certain weaknesses, or they do something else, or they mess with your party, and I really love that. Like it's like the bosses have some fear factor put into them. It's not so much just like breaking and boosting, like in the random encounters, but there's also a very much need to use the other parts of your toolkit instead of just dealing damage or just most of the time how I was playing the game was just feeding and buffing up Hikari, who is my strongest character, and just getting him to do massive damage because he can do massive damage. But with these bosses, it made me really stop to think for a second. Now, I will say that the game is a bit easier, especially towards the end. At the beginning of the game, I was having a lot more struggles because the party's a lot weaker and you don't really have all the active skills unlocked. And also, you don't really have a grasp on the break and boost mechanics. But towards the later half of the game, every single boss, like sure it was nice and grandiose, but for me it just felt like they were just taking my time, like especially when you get to the fact that I could just like literally, I'm not even a JRPG player, I'm not very familiar with the systems, and I didn't really even get that deep into the systems I'm going to talk about in a bit. But for the fact that the game was just so easy for me, it's still kind of jarring, especially because it's like for me as a first time player, I get that it's meant to be accessible, but there should be some sort of difficulty option or some sense. Maybe if I put the hard difficulty, because I played on normal. I don't even remember if there was a difficulty option or not. I'm gonna be honest. I'm literally doing this like completely off, like just being organic and just reading some notes I have here. Nothing crazy, just bullet points. But yeah, and then, but yeah, it was just a little bit too easy for me, especially towards the end. Those boss fights with those grand scales that seemed really, really like minute in comparison, especially when you have Particio and Hikari and like Casti in the same party. That's just ridiculous, bro. You can just buff up Hikari, give him all these stats, give him all the boost points from Particio, and then maybe even add like. And what I would do is I would add like Throne and just get like some defense drops on the guy, and he would just die. And like after 2 or 3 times of me breaking him, he's just dead because of how much damage. And it really felt like it took away from the scale of those boss fights, especially because I could beat them most of them on my first try, except for the early game bosses. The early game bosses did give me a run for my money, and I do think they're a bit harder, honestly. And they are really what drew me into the game at the beginning. But towards the end, it really just felt like, especially when I'm doing the final battle of each character, it's supposed to be this big climactic moment. But because you have so many tools available to you, it just makes it so easy to deal with the bosses. And that kind of diminished the whole game experience for me as a whole, especially when you look at all the different systems that you have available. Like I barely even scratched the surface of all the systems because I could like have done something where I specialize in fire resistance or put this extra boost damage or something like this and really like jacked up a specific character. But for all the equipment stuff, I kind of just clicked optimize all because I could not be bothered like it's putting specific equipment buffs, and so I just got the high stats for everything regardless of like what kind of build I was going for. And even just with that, it was super simple. I will say though that one thing I really, really loved about the game is the party customization. Even though you're kind of stuck with these 4 characters and you have to kind of swap in and out, which I really did appreciate because, like, it's great because in the sense that with these four characters, and I have eight in total, I always have to keep swapping out to make sure my team is adequately leveled, right? And that meant that I was using characters that I wouldn't have used otherwise, and kind of discovered like new ways to use them. Like Particio off rip, for example, I hated using him, but after more and more time, of really just kind of being forced to use him, right? Because I need to get him leveled up. I realized how amazing he was, and that's like one thing. A lot of people don't like that. Like I've been seeing some discourse online that people don't like the fact that you can't just like have all the parties being leveled at the same rate, so that everyone's always the same level, and you don't have to bring the guys from the back to the front and then use them. But I think no, I think that's one of the best things about Octopath Traveler is the fact that it's kind of forcing you to experiment with all these different characters. And I really think that if you just had your main party of four for the entire game, the game would feel a lot more boring, especially because you could just essentially do the same thing every single fight, which gets very boring and repetitive because you get to a point of strength where you don't even need to worry about the breaking and boosting to some extent anymore. You could have one character just literally just break him and then just spam big attacks and it's over. Like you don't really need to focus that much on the combat and the healing and the kind of thinking about what your enemy is weak to. At some point in the game, you just become so strong. But that being said, I love the fact that that being said, it made me interact with like different characters and made me realize every single character has a specific purpose. Like because of this job system, it makes everything so flexible, in the sense that you can kind of you can build your own characters, which I really really enjoyed. Like I had like some obvious ones, like I had Hikari with the arms master and I had Casti with the healer, but then something like I really really enjoyed using Particio with Thief because it just turned him into like a support demon that I'd never even thought about before. And this kind of flexibility really, really made the game fun for me. And I was always switching things out, especially with the fact that support abilities can be transferred over regardless of if you have the job equipped. It just made for the game to have a lot of fun for me. And it's probably one of the big things that kept me coming back as this job and the kind of thrill of going and unlocking new jobs and seeing new synergies with characters you never even thought possible. But that being said, there are a lot of there are a lot of cons in the gameplay that I want to talk about. Specifically, one big thing for me, apart from the random encounters, the job system is great and the combat in of itself is great. But the problem for me is the hand holdingness in some parts of in most of the game. It doesn't let you explore anything from the world. For like I get that you want to have a narrative experience, especially in the story missions where you're guiding the player and the player has to do this and this and this. But like not everything needs to be on the mini map, like for me the game just became like especially during the chapters, because especially at the beginning of the game in chapter 1, and all the chapter 1s are basically the same, right? You come out, there's a bunch of exposition dumped on you about the character, you do some path actions, you do some combat, and then you fight a boss, right? The thing is though, all the stuff about the path actions or going to clear a specific dungeon, it's all choreographed to you. Like you know exactly where to go. There's no sense of mystery in the game. It's like the game would be like, go find a farmer, and I know there's no farmer, but like go find a farmer and steal from him a rake, for example, something stupid like that. And the game will literally indicate to you where he is. You always have the character available to you, especially in those chapter ones, to do exactly that. And it just felt like at some points I was playing a brain dead video game, and for me that really took away the exploration. To kind of contrast this, like I get that it's a narrative experience, but recently I finished A Thousand Times Resist. It's a great game. It takes a lot of inspiration from Nier, but it not in a way of like Stellar Blade where it overly tries to be like Nier like. Even though Stellar Blade's combat is magnificent, I do think that A Thousand Times Resist does a little bit better in terms of the narrative. And in that game, even though it's a very narrative driven experience, like the whole game is literally just like you walking around and talking to people. The game never like puts it on the mini map for you specifically. It's never like go talk to this person. No, you have to find them yourself. Like it's like you have to think a little bit. Like it's obvious where they would be. Like you just have to look around and you'll eventually find them. You always eventually find them, which is great. But that extra little step of like looking to find them is really what brought me together. Because after Octopath, I thought, okay, maybe I just don't like dialogue heavy narrative experiences. And then I played A Thousand Times Resist, and I'm like, holy shit, I love narrative experiences. They just need to let go of my hand for a little bit. And this is a problem kind of reflected on a lot of modern games nowadays. But truth be told, it's a lot less severe, especially in those like open world games where you have the mini maps, because there it's like, okay, it's a huge open world. I would like to know where I'm going, but I do know like I have the freedom to do whatever I want. Whereas in Octopath, any like thing I do is just kind of handholdy. But What's jarring is that when you have all this handholdy stuff in the main quests, and then you go to the side quests, and there's like no information at all. And I really loved doing the side quests. I'll give them that. Like the side quests, there was the side quest that lets you unlock the final area in the game, for example. I don't even know if it lets you unlock the final area, but it's like the side quest. And then I went to the final area by mistake, and I got a cutscene that I didn't, that I, with all the characters there, even though I hadn't beaten all the chapters yet, and that's because I did the side quest. And I was like, wow, my actions have consequences, and also made me feel like accomplished that I found that side quest myself. Like it's a series of side quests, and I did things out of my own volition, and somehow it worked out. Whereas if I compare it to like the story missions, there's no sense of accomplishment in what I'm doing because I'm literally just following a green marker all the way. And the main problem with me in the story, especially, is the fact that the chapter ones are just horrible. First of all, like the chapter one. Here's my problem. I started my chapter one with Hikari, which I think probably has like one of the best chapters ones of the whole cast. You should go in this big fight. Immediately, you're just fighting, and you're fighting for this grand sense of scale. You're fighting for your kingdom. You're getting expelled from your kingdom. You have to flee. It's a huge thing. But then I look at other chapter ones like Agnia's becoming a dancer, or like for example, even like Particio is leaving his little town and rescuing it from poverty. Cool. I loved Particio at the end, but at the beginning he was insufferable for me. But for me, the main thing is the structure of the chapters, in the sense that you're always doing the same thing in chapter one. And for me, especially those first 10 hours, because everyone I had looked online was saying Octopath Traveler 2 gets way better after chapter 1. You just have to push through. So I did because I had some time. I was like, you know what? I'm going to really give this game a shot. I really pushed through. I cleared all the chapter 1s, and then the game just opened up to me immensely. Because all of a sudden, all the chapters were not the exact same thing over and over again. Like, I remember clearing a chapter, I think it was one of Agnia's chapters, where it was just all story. There was no fighting, no nothing. And I was just such a refreshing take. Or some chapters where there's just a boss, and that's it. No dungeon, no nothing. And I just loved that because it really made me feel like that's the kind of game where things are different and it's progressing. Because chapters, I love the idea of the chapters, especially for a Switch player. It makes it for a very easy pick up and play experience, making it a lot less daunting than other RPGs where like I feel like I have a lot of other things to do. Compared to Octopath Traveler 2, where it's like, okay, I'm just gonna pick up my Switch, I'm gonna play one chapter, put it down. And that made for a very nice experience, especially like after long days, kind of just turn my brain off, just open up my Switch, clear a chapter, and then that's it. But the chapters itself, it's a great concept, and I really, really like it, but I feel like they need to be a little bit more interconnected. And I know that the whole point of the game is that they all converge at the end, but for me, the motivation to really finish the chapters, especially at the end of the game, dwindled extremely fast. Especially like at the beginning of the game, I had a lot of motivation to go through the chapters, but then it got to a point where I would be like in the mid game, I'm going between all these different characters and all these different stories, but I really couldn't fully get myself invested in them. Even Oswald's story, which I thought was magnificent. I thought it was pretty cool. I thought the twists in Oswald's story were really, really cool. Just the chapter format and the fact that it's like I just cleared Oswald's chapter, now I have to go clear like 6 other different characters and do with their story. Half of them I did not care about at all. Just to come back to this one, it made me really take away from the experience. And also another thing of the chapters is that like I know, like it's pretty obvious. The thing is, you're not gonna have really high stakes because you know which characters are gonna die and which ones can't. You know which characters cannot be harmed. Basically, you main every single character that you play as, and some of the characters also they're just not gonna be harmed. So it really, really takes some of the stakes from each scene, especially when you take into a fact that it just ignores the existence of all the other party members. And I know that the cross paths do try to remedy this by putting 2 together, and I really, really enjoyed seeing their interactions. But the cross path missions for me were very boring, and they really, really took away from the main experience for me, which is like, well, it's such a shame because seeing the party members interact in that way, and even in that little cutscene and just in the cross paths, was so great to see, and like that's the kind of experience I wanted, where I can actually feel the character, because one thing is your characters interacting with just the NPCs around them, not your main party. But it's that party interaction that really keeps you going. And then the thing is, there are party interactions in the story missions. The game like puts you aside. You can click a button and you get a special dialogue box. But this dialogue boxes are ridiculous, in my opinion at least, because they have nothing to do with the game, what you're playing. They're just random things that pop up, and it's like, okay. Like, sure, sometimes they are with the context, but other times it's like, I'm literally about to fight this big boss. They just made a huge scene and I don't know what in the story, and then it's like, oh, dialogue option, boop, and it's like them some guys talking about soup. I'm like, okay, bro, like this for me, So I think this idea that it's really, really like the story really doesn't have stakes for me, especially because no one's gonna die and the party members just don't interact with each other. So it's like, okay, it's this guy and everyone else is just kind of watching them in the background, and then as soon as it's time to fight, everyone comes back in, and then as soon as it's time to go back through the dungeon, everyone comes back in, but then they arrive at the NPC and they talk, and it's just the main character and the NPC. It just doesn't make any sense to me, and that really, really took him away from the story. But like I said, it does make the game a lot more digestible, which is a big bonus for me, especially as someone who's never played a JRPG. And I really, really felt that it was a little bit, like towards the end, I really felt like I was getting a washed down experience. Like after putting a lot of hours, 60, I have like 60 hours in the game. I do not plan on coming back, unfortunately, to finish off. But after like yeah, it really felt like I was playing a watered down experience where I really couldn't feel the main interaction and the whole thing, the whole game that the story was building up to. It just takes too long to build up to that. Like I know JRPGs are supposed to be long, and I completely understand that, but it gets to a point where like I don't even feel like I've reached the tip of the surface of how the party members interact with each other, and that really really took me away from the engagement of the game because the combat was fun, but then it got easy. The story was good, but then it got boring because I was hopping between different chapters all the time. The only thing that really really kept me going mainly throughout the whole game was the art style, because can I just say that Square and the other team that made it, I forget the name. I think it's Acquire. Square Enix and Acquire. Acquire is a sub team of Square, I remember. Yes. The HD 2D art style that Octopath Traveler 1 pioneered is phenomenal. I think it's probably one of the best things to come out of the Switch, especially because the Switch in of itself is a console that really kind of forces developers to kind of think like instead of pushing for all this graphical fidelity all the time you see on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox One Series X, you're really thinking, how can I make a game look good? And I really think Octopath Traveler 1 and 2 are a celebration of this with this HD 2D art style. With a callback to these like traditional like GBA and SNES style graphics that are just so that hold up just so well even today. And to go with this, the cities themselves have such a grand sense of scale. Like Flame Church, for example, you're walking in there, and even though it's a small place, you can see all these houses in the distance, and the way that the art style is like the little bit of HDness that the 2D gets makes everything so layered on top of each other with the backdrops and everything. It really made me feel like I was going through a huge, sprawling world, especially with the setting that came across with this medieval setting but brink on the industrial revolution was a really interesting idea because especially with some characters it really felt like there was active change happening in the world as I was playing through the game, much like the industrial era itself, and that really really drew me in. So, sorry, I'm kind of doing this in one take, but especially with the industrial, especially with this like HD 2D stuff, it really really brought me back to like when I was playing video games as a kid on my like Nintendo DS, for example, like Pokemon Diamond for it, and I was playing and I really really felt like these cities were huge and gigantic. When I play Pokemon Diamond today, for example, I really don't feel that sense of scale. Like a Pokemon city is like 5 houses, 6 houses, but when I was a kid, it felt so grand. And the Octopath Traveler 2 HD 2D art style really really captures this feeling once again, and I really think that it's for a permanent way, and I'm really excited to see how the team iterates on this because Octopath Traveler 2 looks leagues better than Octopath Traveler 1. And HD2D has, in and of itself, is not limited to the specific Octopath art style. Like you have Live Alive from Square as well, which took it in a slightly different direction. But then you have Star Ocean, the second story art. I have not played the game. I played like 1 hour of the demo. I didn't really like it, but the art style was absolutely crazy. And I think that in and of itself is something that we're going to see a lot more in the coming years, especially with the Switch 2. When the graphical boost we're getting, I'm a Switch 2 supporter. It's coming, I believe. And yeah, but like I said before, there are some limitations, especially with the emotions and heavy dialogue scenes that don't really well get interpreted. And the thing is, with these old games, like with the 16-bit art style, you can kind of interpret, like it's all up to the imagination. But to some extent, when I'm just getting fed dialogue after dialogue after dialogue the entire game, I need a little bit more. I really, really need a little bit more. But the one thing that really drew the art style for me altogether was this particle effects that just defied all the plane of existence in the 2D art style, and it really made me feel like I was playing a new gen, like I was playing a new game, you know, because it feels like at some points that I'm just playing a really antiquated experience, especially with how the random encounters feel a little bit sluggish, and like the setting, it whilst is very cool, and there are some areas of the game which are gorgeous. You also have stuff like Crestlands and Timberane, which are just like kind of boring medievally cities, you know. Like there's a lot of medievally boring fantasy cities. I'm not really a huge fan of fantasy. It needs to be done in such a way that's very unique from other fantasies, but fantasy genre as a whole, especially as a kid growing up in the 2000s, like I'm born 2005, right? So especially in that time frame, fantasy and sci-fi are very much oversaturated for me in media, and I really, really need something more than just a generic fantasy scene to really, really get me involved. And these particle effects really, really drove the game home for me, especially in those big story moments and powerful effects were coming. I really felt like I was playing this grandiose adventure, as opposed to me just playing like a a generic fantasy game. And one last thing I wanted to talk about in the art style was just the monster design of itself. I thought they were pretty good. I really enjoyed the fact that the monsters were not bound to the same like plane as the humans. They really went kind of bizarre on. They kind of went crazy on the scaling. They went crazy on the designs, and I do think that they're very, very like imposing and intimidating, especially the bosses. Like I was saying before, how they loom over you is crazy. But also some regular NPC, but also some regular monsters that you just encounter out in the world. You can look at them and you're like, oh god, I'm about to fight this difficult monster. Let me lock in a bit, you know. And that for me, the idea that you can kind of just intrinsically identify how difficult a monster is just on something as simple as just their design is just great. And it's not like all the designs of the scary monsters are just gigantic with huge fangs and I don't know what. Like you have a golem, for example, which is pretty terrifying, but it's just tall, you know, and you're like, oh god, this is way bigger than all the other monsters just by the size alone, you know. I think that kind of implicit game design really, really lends itself well, especially when you're considering that it's like a 2D art style, so it's all about letting the imagination go. And at that point, you're just letting the imagination go crazy when you're thinking about these monsters. And it really drove the combat home for me as well at the end of the day. And that was my main thoughts about the game. This was a very long rant. I did not expect it to rant for 27 minutes, but I kind of just wanted to give the conclusion. And whether or not I would actually like recommend Octopath Traveler 2 to somebody. I really have mixed emotions about the game. Because on one hand, I really, really did enjoy it. The job system, the gameplay, the art style was great. And I felt like for someone who had never really played a JRPG before, it was really great introduction for me. It was very digestible, very easy. And the turn-based combat was fed to me slowly, and I felt like I was learning more and more each time. And it made me learn about the intricacies of party and how to balance between like playing supports, healing, offense, and all these other different things that I hadn't really considered before when playing other games. Because like the other main like turn-based game I was playing was Pokemon, and that also has a lot of complicated elements, especially in those ROM hacks. But it's also like you only have one Pokemon out or two at a time, you know. But when you have four and you're looking to manipulate turn order by breaking and boosting, it's just a whole other level, and it's great. And as a whole, I think Octopath Traveler 2 also pushing me to try out other JRPGs. Like I'm really looking forward to try out Metaphor whenever I can get my hands on that, and also the Final Fantasy 7 remake, and probably Final Fantasy 9 because people say that one's pretty good. But let me know. And but that being said, there was a lot of downsides. Like I feel like the game really, really, really drags on. Like the chapter stuff is great at the initial point. This pick up and play is great. It's very digestible, but it gets to a point where I just need the story to progress. You know, I need things to happen, and I need there to be stakes because there were no stakes at all throughout the entire story. And with a game with so much dialogue and narrative-driven stuff, and all the dialogue, and all the fact that you just spend most of the time in the game, you're either grinding out a little bit, or you're in the story reading dialogue. It just gets to a point, you know. Like I need something that brings me more, something, because like each individual story is great, most of them are pretty good, but the fact is that they have no scale in the outer world. You might have said the fact there's no stakes because it's just their individual character story, you know. Like I go take down the big bad, but no, it's just the big bad of one person. No, it doesn't really feel like I've taken down any big bad. And yes, I know there's a final boss fight at the end of the last chapter, and I don't know what. I'm not gonna do it. I cannot do the cross paths anymore. They are way too boring. But in retrospect, I did pick up Octopath on sale for 30 euros, right? And for that regard, I have definitely gotten my money's worth. Like you do not, like it is. I did play a lot of it, and I did enjoy it. I would recommend it to people, but I think it's a very specific type of person who would enjoy it. I think if you're really, really, really into JRPGs, because some people say it's their favorite, like game of 2023, and I don't know what. It's not my favorite, but if you're really, really, really into RPGs, and I think if you can really get into the intricacies of the system, because I didn't really get that deep into the equipment and the combat systems myself. I just kept it surface level, but I think there's a lot of customizability there, even if it's a very basic level of customization. And then if you just make it through, and I'm sure the payoff is great at the end of the game. And I think truly it's a great introduction to JRPGs. So overall, I would recommend it. And that's everything I had to say about Octopath. Let me know what you guys think of this like rant style. This is my first ever kind of content I'm producing about video games and trying to put out online. I really just wanted to get my thoughts out there, kind of produce something, and not really like give it too much thought or have too much of a script. Just some notes and just a little bit of my thoughts. I think is the most important thing for me to convey. And all the footage you're seeing, I'm just taking it from somewhere else. I'll leave a link in the bio. But let me know what you guys like, don't like, what you want to see next, something else. And yeah, thank you for listening.